Section 31 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 1. The city of Bussorah was for many years the capital of a kingdom tributary to the caliphs of Arabia. The king who governed it in the days of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid was named Zenebi, who, not thinking it proper to commit the administration of his affairs to a single vizier, made choice of two, Khakan and Sawi. Khakan was of a sweet, generous, and affable temper, and took pleasure in obliging to the utmost of his power those with whom he had any business to transact, without violating the justice which it became him to dispense to all. He was therefore universally respected at court, in the city, and throughout the whole kingdom, and the praises he so highly deserved were the general theme. Sawi was of a very different character. He was always sullen and morose, and disgusted everybody without regard to their rank or quality, instead of commanding respect by the liberal distribution of his immense wealth. He was so perfect a miser as to deny himself the necessaries of life. In short, nobody could endure him, and nothing good was said of him. But what rendered him most hateful to the people was his implacable aversion to Khakan. He was always putting the worst construction on the actions of that worthy minister, and endeavoring as much as possible to prejudice him with the king. One day, after council, the king of Bussorah amused himself with his two viziers and some other members. The conversation turned upon the female slaves that are daily bought and sold, and who hold nearly the same rank as the lawful wives. Some were of opinion that personal beauty in slaves so purchased was of itself sufficient to render them proper substitutes for wives, which often, on account of alliance or interest in families, men are obliged to marry, though they are not always possessed of any perfection either of mind or body. Others maintained, and amongst the rest Khakan, that personal charms were by no means the only qualifications to be desired in a slave, but that they ought to be accompanied with a great share of wit, a cultivated understanding, modesty, and, if possible, every agreeable accomplishment. The reason they gave was, that nothing could be more gratifying to persons on whom the management of important affairs devolved, than, after having spent the day in fatiguing employment, to have a companion in their retirement, whose conversation would be not only pleasing but useful and instructive. For, in short, continued they, there is but little difference between brutes and those men who keep a slave only to look at, and to gratify a passion that we have in common with them. The king entirely concurred in this opinion, and accordingly ordered Khakan to buy him a slave of perfect beauty, mistress of all the qualifications they had enumerated, and possessed above all things of an enlightened understanding. Sawi, jealous of the honor the king had done Khakan, and differing widely with him in opinion, said, "Sire, it will be very difficult to find a slave so accomplished as your majesty requires, and should such a one be discovered, which I scarcely believe possible, she will be cheap at 10,000 pieces of gold." "Sawi," replied the king, "I perceive plainly you think the sum too great. It may be so for you, though not for me." Then, turning to his high treasurer, he ordered him to send the 10,000 pieces of gold to the vizier's house. Khakan, as soon as he had returned home, sent for all the brokers who used to deal in women slaves, and strictly charged them that if ever they met with one who answered the description he gave them, they should immediately apprise him. The brokers, partly to oblige the vizier, and partly for their own interest, promised to use their utmost endeavours to procure for him one that would accord with his wishes. Scarcely a day passed but they brought him a slave for his inspection, but he always discovered in each something defective. One day, early in the morning, as Khakan was mounting his horse to go to court, a broker came to him, and taking hold of the stirrup, with great eagerness told him a Persian merchant had arrived very late the day before, who had a slave to sell so surprisingly beautiful that she excelled all the women his eyes had ever beheld. And for wit and knowledge, added he, the merchant engages she shall match the most acute and learned persons of the age. Khacan, overjoyed at this intelligence, which promised him a favourable opportunity for making his court, ordered him to bring the slave to his palace against his return, and departed. The broker failed not to be at the vizier's at the appointed hour, and Khacan, finding the lovely slave so much beyond his expectation, immediately gave her the name of the fair Persian. As he had himself much wit and learning, he soon perceived by her conversation that it was in vain to search further for a slave that surpassed her in any of the qualifications required by the king, and therefore he asked the broker at what sum the Persian merchant valued her. "Sir," replied the broker, "he is a man of few words in bargaining, and he tells me that the very lowest price he will take for her is 10,000 pieces of gold. He has also sworn to me that without reckoning his care and pains from the time of his first taking her under his charge, he has laid out nearly that sum on her education in masters to improve her form and cultivate her mind, besides what she has cost him in clothes and maintenance. As he always thought her fit for a king, he has from her infancy, when he first bought her, been sparing of nothing that might contribute towards advancing her to that high distinction. She plays upon all kinds of instruments to perfection. She sings, dances, writes better than the most celebrated authors, makes verses, and there is scarcely any book but she has read, so that there never was a slave so accomplished heard of before." The vizier Khacan, who could estimate the merits of the fair Persian better than the broker, who only reported what he had heard from the merchant, was unwilling to defer the bargain to a future opportunity, and therefore sent one of his servants to look for the merchant where the broker told him he was to be found. As soon as the Persian merchant arrived, "It is not for myself but for the king," said the vizier Khacan, "that I buy your slave, but nevertheless you must let him have her at a more reasonable price than you have set upon her." "Sir," replied the merchant, "I should do myself unspeakable honour in offering her as a present to his majesty if it became a person in my situation to make him one of such inestimable value. I ask no more than her education and accomplishments have cost me, and all I have to say is that I believe his majesty will be extremely pleased with the purchase." The vizier Khacan would stand no longer bargaining with the merchant, but paid him the money immediately. "Sir," said he to the vizier, upon taking his leave of him, "since the slave is designed for the king's use, give me leave to tell you that being extremely fatigued with our long journey, you see her at present under great disadvantage. Though she has not her equal in the world for beauty, yet if you please to keep her at your own house for a fortnight, she will appear quite another creature. You may then present her to the king with honour and credit, for which I hope you will think yourself much obliged to me. The sun, you perceive, has a little injured her complexion, but after 2 or 3 times bathing, and when you have dressed her as you think proper, she will be so changed that she will appear infinitely more charming." Khacan was pleased with the instructions the merchant gave him, and resolved to abide by them. He assigned the fair Persian a particular apartment near his ladies, whom he desired to invite her to an entertainment, and thenceforth to treat her as a person designed for the king. He also provided for her several suits of the richest clothes that could be had, and would become her best. Before he took his leave of the fair Persian, he said, "Your happiness, madam, cannot be greater than what I am about to procure for you. You shall judge for yourself. It is for the king I have purchased you, and I hope he will be even more pleased with possessing you than I am in having discharged the commission with which his majesty has honoured me. I think it, however, my duty to warn you that I have a son who, though he does not want wit, is yet young, insinuating, and forward, and to caution you how you suffer him to come near you." The fair Persian thanked him for his advice, and after she had given him assurance of her intention to follow it, he withdrew. Nur ad-Din, for so the vizier's son was named, had free access to the apartment of his mother, with whom he usually ate his meals. He was young, handsome in person, agreeable in manners, and firm in his temper, and having great readiness of wit and fluency of language, was perfect master of the art of persuasion. He saw the fair Persian, and from their first interview, though he knew his father had bought her purposely for the king, and had so informed him, yet he never used the least endeavour to check the violence of his passion. In short, he resigned himself wholly to the power of her charms, by which his heart was at first captivated, and from his first conversation with her resolved to use his utmost endeavours to keep her from the king. The fair Persian, on her part, had no dislike to Nur ad-Din. The vizier, said she to herself, has done me honour in purchasing me for the king, but I should have thought myself very happy if he had designed me only for his own son. Nur ad-Din was not remiss in improving the advantage he enjoyed of seeing and conversing with a beauty of whom he was so passionately enamoured, for he would never leave her till obliged by his mother. My son, she would say, it is not proper for a young man like you to be always in the women's apartments. Go, mind your studies, and endeavour to qualify yourself to succeed to the honours of your father. The fair Persian not having bathed for a considerable time, on account of the length of her journey, the vizier's lady, 5 or 6 days after she was purchased, ordered the bath in her own house to be got ready purposely for her. She sent her to it accompanied by many other women slaves who were charged by the vizier's lady to be as attentive to her as to herself, and after bathing to put her on a very rich suit of clothes that she had provided for her. She was the more careful in order to ingratiate herself with her husband by letting him see how much she interested herself in everything that contributed to his pleasure. As soon as she came out of the bath, the fair Persian, 1,000 times more beautiful than she had appeared to Khacan when he had bought her, went to visit his lady, who at first hardly knew her. The fair Persian gracefully kissed her hand and said, Madam, I know not how you like me in this dress you have been pleased to order for me, but your women who tell me it becomes me so extremely well they should scarcely know me certainly flatter me. From you alone I expect to hear the truth, but if what they say be really so, I am indebted to you, madam, for the advantage it has given me. Oh, my daughter, cried the vizier's lady, transported with joy, you have no reason to believe my women have flattered you. I am better skilled in beauty than they, and setting aside your dress, which becomes you admirably well, your beauty is so much improved by the bath that I hardly knew you myself. If I thought the bath was warm enough, I would take my turn, for I am now of an age to require its frequent use. Madam, replied the fair Persian, I have nothing to say to the undeserved civilities you have been pleased to show me. As for the bath, it is in fine order, and if you design to go in, you have no time to lose, as your women can inform you. The vizier's lady, considering that she had not bathed for some days, was desirous to avail herself of that opportunity, and accordingly acquainted her women with her intention, who immediately prepared all things necessary for the occasion. The fair Persian withdrew to her apartment, and the vizier's lady, before she went to bathe, ordered 2 little female slaves to stay with her, with a strict charge that if Nur ad-Din came, they should not give him admittance. While the vizier's lady was bathing and the fair slave was alone in her apartment, Nur ad-Din came in, and not finding his mother in her chamber, went directly towards the fair Persians, and found the 2 little slaves in the ante-chamber. He asked them where his mother was. They told him in the bath. Where is the fair Persian, then? Demanded Nur ad-Din. In her chamber, answered the slaves, but we have positive orders from your mother not to admit you. The entrance into the fair Persian's chamber being only covered with a piece of tapestry, Nur ad-Din went to lift it up in order to enter, but was opposed by the 2 slaves, who placed themselves before it to stop his passage. He presently caught them both by the arms, and thrusting them out of the ante-chamber, locked the door upon them. They immediately ran with loud lamentations to the bath, and with tears in their eyes told their lady that Nur ad-Din, having driven them away by force, had gone into the fair Persian's chamber. The vizier's lady received the account of her son's presumption with the greatest concern. She immediately left the bath, and dressing herself with all possible speed, came directly to the fair Persian's chamber, but before she could get thither, Nur ad-Din had gone away. The fair Persian was extremely surprised to see the vizier's lady enter her chamber in tears, and in the utmost confusion. Madam, said she, may I presume to ask you the occasion of your concern, and what accident has happened in the bath to make you leave it so soon? What, cried the vizier's lady, can you so calmly ask that question after my son has been with you alone in your chamber? Can there happen a greater misfortune to him or me? I beseech you, madam, replied the fair slave, what prejudice can this action of Nur ad-Din's do to you or him? How, returned the vizier's lady, did not my husband tell you that you were designed for the king, and sufficiently caution you to beware of our son? "I've not forgotten that, madam," replied the fair Persian, "but your son came to tell me the vizier, his father, had changed his purpose, and instead of reserving me for the king, as he first designed, had made him a present of my person. I easily believed him, for oh, think how a slave as I am, accustomed from my infant years to the laws of servitude, could or ought to resist him. I must own I did it with the less reluctance on account of the affection for him which the freedom of our conversation and daily intercourse has excited in my heart. I could, without regret, resign the hope of ever being the king's, and think myself perfectly happy in spending my whole life with Nur ad-Din." At this discourse the fair Persians, the vizier's lady exclaimed, "Would to God that what you say were true! I should hear it with joy, but believe me, Nur ad-Din has deceived you, for it is impossible his father should ever make him such a present. Ah, wretched youth, how miserable has he made me, and more especially his father, by the dismal consequences we must all expect to share with him. Neither my prayers nor tears will be able to prevail or obtain a pardon for him, for as soon as his father hears of his violence to you, he will inevitably sacrifice him to his resentment." At these words she wept bitterly, and the slaves, who were as much alarmed for Nur ad-Din as herself, joined in her tears. End of section 31.
Section 32 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 2. Shortly after the Vizier Khacan entered, and, being surprised to find his lady and her slaves all in tears, and the fair Persian very melancholy, asked the reason. But instead of answering him, his wife and the slaves continued weeping and lamenting. This astonished him still more. At last, addressing himself to his wife, "I command you," said he, "to let me know the reason of your tears, and to tell me the whole truth." The disconsolate lady could no longer refuse to satisfy her husband. "Sir," said she, "first promise not to use me unkindly, on account of what I shall inform you, since I assure you that what has happened has not been occasioned by any fault of mine." Without waiting for his answer, she then proceeded. "Whilst I was bathing with my women, your son, seizing that fatal opportunity to ruin us both, came hither and made the fair Persian believe that instead of reserving her for the king, you had given her to him as a present. I will not say what he did after such a wicked falsehood, but shall leave you to judge. This is the cause of my affliction on your account and his, for whom I want confidence to implore your pardon." It is impossible to express the Vizier Khacan's distraction at this account of the insolence of his son. "Ah!" cried he, beating his breast and tearing his beard, "miserable son, unworthy of life! Hast thou at last thrown thy father from the highest pinnacle of happiness into a misfortune that must inevitably involve thee also in his ruin? Neither will the king be satisfied with thy blood or mine to avenge the affront offered to his royal person." His lady endeavoured to comfort him. "Afflict yourself no more," said she. "I shall easily raise, with part of my jewels, 10,000 pieces of gold, and you may buy another slave, more beautiful and more worthy of the king." "Ah!" replied the vizier, "could you think me capable of being so extremely afflicted at losing 10,000 pieces of gold? It is not that loss, nor the loss of all I am worth, for that I should not feel, but the forfeiting my honour, more precious than all the riches in the world, that distresses me." "However," replied the lady, "a loss that can be repaired by money cannot be so very great." "How?" exclaimed the vizier. "Do you not know that Saoni is my mortal enemy, and as soon as this affair comes to his knowledge, do you think he will not exult over me before the king? Your Majesty, will he not say to him, is always talking of Khacan's zeal and affection for your service, but see what a proof he has lately given of his claim to the regard you have hitherto shown him. He has received 10,000 pieces of gold to buy a slave, and to do him justice, he has most honourably acquitted himself of that commission by purchasing the most beautiful that ever eyes beheld. But instead of bringing her to your majesty, he has thought it better to make a present of her to his son. Here, my son, said he, take this slave, since thou art more worthy of her than the king. Then, with his usual malice, will he not go on? His son has her now entirely in his possession, and every day revels in her arms, without the least disturbance. This, sir, is the exact truth that I have done myself the honour of acquainting you with, and if your majesty questions my veracity, you may easily satisfy yourself. Do you not plainly see, continued the vizier, how upon such a malicious insinuation as this I am every moment liable to have my house forced by the king's guards, and the fair Persian taken from me, besides 1,000 other misfortunes that will unavoidably follow? Sir, replied the vizier's lady to her husband, I am sensible the malice of Saouy is very great, and that, if he have but the least intimation of this affair, he will certainly give it a turn very disadvantageous to your interest. But how is it possible that he or anyone else should know what has been privately transacted in your family? Suppose it comes to the king's ears, and he should ask you about it. Cannot you say that upon a strict examination you did not deem the slave so fit for his majesty's use as you had at first taught her, that the merchant has cheated you, that indeed she has considerable beauty, but is by no means so accomplished as she had been represented? The king will certainly believe what you say, and Saouy be vexed to the soul to see all his malicious design of ruining you disappointed. Take courage then, and if you will follow my advice, send for all the brokers, tell them you do not like the fair Persian, and order them to be as expeditious as possible in procuring for you another slave. As this advice appeared rational to the vizier Khacan, and as his position began to cool, he resolved to abide by it, but his indignation against his son remained as violent as ever. Nur ad-Din did not make his appearance during the whole of that day, and not daring to hide himself among his young companions, lest his father should search for him in their houses, he went a little way out of town, and took sanctuary in a garden where he had never been before, and where he was totally unknown. He did not return home till it was very late, when he knew his father was in bed, and then his mother's woman, opening the door very softly, admitted him without any noise. He quitted the house again next morning before his father was stirring, and this plan he pursued for a whole month, to his great mortification. Indeed, the woman never flattered him, but told him plainly his father's anger was not at all diminished, and that he protested if he came into his sight, he would certainly kill him. The vizier's lady learnt from her women that Nur ad-Din slept every night in the house, but she could not summon resolution to supplicate her husband for his pardon. At last, however, she ventured. One day she said to him, I have hitherto been silent, sir, not daring to take the liberty of talking to you about your son. But now give me leave to ask you what you design to do with him. It is impossible for a son to have acted more criminally towards a father than he has done, in depriving you of the honour and gratification of presenting to the king a slave so accomplished as the fair Persian. This I acknowledge. But, after all, are you resolved to destroy him, and instead of a light evil no more to be thought of, to draw upon yourself a far greater than perhaps you at present apprehend? Are you not afraid that the malicious world, which inquires after the reason of your son's absconding, may find out the true cause, which you are so desirous of concealing? Should that happen, you would justly fall into a misfortune, which is so much your interest to avoid. Madam, returned the vizier, there is much reason in what you have urged, but I cannot think of pardoning our son till I have mortified him as he deserves. He will be sufficiently mortified, replied the lady, if you will only do what has just suggested itself to my mind. Your son comes home every night after you have retired. He sleeps here and steals out every morning before you are stirring. Wait for his coming in tonight, make as if you designed to kill him, upon which I will run to his assistance, and when he finds he owes his life entirely to my prayers and entreaties, you may oblige him to take the fair Persian on what condition you please. He loves her, and I am well satisfied the fair slave has no aversion for him. Khacan readily consented to this stratagem. Accordingly, when Nur ad-Din came at the usual hour, before the door was opened, he placed himself behind it. As soon as he entered, he rushed suddenly upon him, and got him down under his feet. Nur ad-Din, lifting up his head, saw his father with a dagger in his hand, ready to stab him. At that instant his mother arrived, and catching hold of the vizier's arm, cried, "Sir, what are you doing?" "Let me alone," replied the vizier, "that I may kill this base unworthy son." "You shall kill me first," returned the mother. "Never will I suffer you to imbue your hands in your own blood." Nur ad-Din improved this moment. "My father," cried he with tears in his eyes, "I implore your clemency and compassion, nor must you deny me pardon, since I ask it in his name before whom we must all appear at the last day." Khacan suffered the dagger to be taken out of his hand, and as soon as Nur ad-Din was released, he threw himself at his father's feet and kissed them, to shew how sincerely he repented of having offended him. "Son," said the vizier, "return thanks to your mother, since it is for her sake I pardon you. I propose also to give you the fair Persian, on condition that you will bind yourself by an oath not to regard her any longer as a slave but as your wife, that you will not sell her nor ever be divorced from her. As she possesses an excellent understanding and abundantly more wit and prudence than yourself, I doubt not but that she will be able to moderate those rash sallies of youth, which are otherwise so likely to effect your ruin." Nur ad-Din, who little expected such indulgent treatment, returned his father 1,000 thanks, and the fair Persian and he were well pleased with being united to each other. The vizier Khacan, without waiting for the king's inquiries about the succession of the commission he had given him, took particular care to mention the subject often, representing to his majesty the many difficulties he met, and how fearful he was of not acquitting himself to his majesty's satisfaction. In short, he managed the business with so much address that the king insensibly forgot it. Though Saouy had gained some intimation of the transaction, yet Khacan was so much in the king's favour that he was afraid to divulge what he had heard. This delicate affair had now been kept rather more than a year with greater secrecy than the vizier had first expected, when being one day in the bath, and some important business obliging him to leave it, warm as he was, the air, which was then cold, struck to his breast, caused a defluxion to fall upon his lungs, which threw him into a violent fever, and confined him to his bed. His illness increasing every day, and perceiving he had not long to live, he thus addressed himself to his son, who never quitted him during the whole of his illness. "My son," said he, "I know not whether I have well employed the riches heaven has blessed me with, but you see they are not able to save me from the hands of death. The last thing I desire of you with my dying breath is, that you would be mindful of the promise you made me concerning the fair Persian, and in this assurance I shall die content." These were the vizier Khacan's last words. He expired a few moments after, and left his family, the court, and the whole city in great affliction. The king lamented him as a wise, zealous, and faithful minister, and the people bewailed him as their protector and benefactor. Never was there a funeral in Basra solemnized with greater pomp and magnificence. The viziers, emirs, and in general all the grandees of the court strove for the honour of bearing his coffin, one after another, upon their shoulders, to the place of burial, and both rich and poor accompanied him, dissolved in tears. Nur ad-Din exhibited all the demonstrations of a sorrow proportioned to the loss he had sustained, and long refrained from seeing any company. At last he admitted of a visit from an intimate acquaintance. His friend endeavoured to comfort him, and finding him inclined to hear reason, told him that having paid what was due to the memory of his father, and fully satisfied all that decency required of him, it was now high time to appear again in the world, to converse with his friends, and maintain a character suitable to his birth and talents. For, continued he, though we should sin against the laws both of nature and society, and be thought insensible, if, on the death of our fathers, we neglected to pay them the duties which filial love imposes upon us, yet having performed these, and put it out of the power of any to reproach us for our conduct, it behoves us to return to the world and our customary occupations. Dry up your tears, then, and resume that wonted air of gaiety which has always inspired with joy those who have had the honour of your friendship. This advice seemed too reasonable to be rejected, and had Nur ad-Din strictly abided by it, he would certainly have avoided all the misfortunes that afterwards befell him. He entertained his friend honourably, and when he took his leave, desired him to come again the next day, and bring with him 3 or 4 friends of their acquaintance. By this means he insensibly fell into the society of about 10 young men nearly of his own age, with whom he spent his time in continual feasting and entertainments, and scarcely a day passed but he made every one of them some considerable present. The fair Persian, who never approved of his extravagant way of living, often spoke her mind freely. "I question not," said she, "but the vizier your father has left you an ample fortune, but great as it may be not displeased with your slave for telling you that at this rate of living you will quickly see an end of it. We may sometimes indeed treat our friends, and be merry with them, but to make a daily practice of it is certainly the high road to ruin and destruction. For your own honour and reputation, you would do better to follow the footsteps of your deceased father, that in time you may rise to that dignity by which he acquired so much glory and renown." Nur ad-Din hearkened to the fair Persian with a smile, and when she had done, "My charmer," said he, with the same air of gaiety, "say no more of that. Let us talk of nothing but mirth and pleasure. In my father's lifetime I was always under restraint, and I am now resolved to enjoy the liberty I so much sighed for before his death. It will be time enough for me hereafter to think of leading the sober, regular life you talk of, and a man of my age ought to taste the pleasures of youth." What contributed still more to the ruin of Nur ad-Din's fortune was his unwillingness to reckon with his steward, for whenever he brought in his accounts he still sent him away without examining them. "Go, go," he said, "I trust wholly to your honesty. Only take care to provide good entertainments for my friends." "You are the master, sir," replied he, "and I but the steward. However, you would do well to think upon the proverb, 'He that spends much, and has but little, must at last insensibly be reduced to poverty.' You are not contented with keeping an extravagant table, but you must lavish away your estate with both hands, and were your coffers as large as mountains, they would not be sufficient to maintain you." "Begone!" replied Nur ad-Din, "I want not your grave lessons. Only take care to provide good eating and drinking, and trouble your head no further about the rest." In the meantime, Nur ad-Din's friends were constant guests at his table, and never failed to take advantage of the easiness of his temper. They praised and flattered him, extolling his most indifferent actions, but above all they took particular care to commend whatever belonged to him, and in this they found their account. "Sir," said one of them, "I came the other day by your estate that lies in such a place. Nothing can be so magnificent or so handsomely furnished as your house, and the garden belonging to it is a paradise upon earth." "I am very glad it pleases you," replied Nur ad-Din. "Bring me pen, ink, and paper. Without more words, it is at your service. I make you a present of it." No sooner had others commended one of his houses, baths, or public buildings, erected for the use of strangers, the yearly revenue of which was very considerable, than he immediately gave them away. The fair Persian could not forbear stating to him how much injury he did himself, but instead of paying any regard to her remonstrances, he continued his extravagances, and the first opportunity that offered, squandered away the little he had left. In short, Nur ad-Din did nothing for a whole year but feast and make merry, wasting and consuming with the utmost prodigality the great wealth that his predecessors and the good vizier his father had with so much pains and care acquired and preserved. The year was but just expired when a person one day knocked at the door of the hall, where he and his friends were at dinner together by themselves, having sent away the slaves that they might enjoy the greater liberty. One of his friends offered to rise, but Nur ad-Din, stepping before him, opened the door himself. It was the steward, and Nur ad-Din, going a little out of the hall to know his business, left the door half open. The friend that offered to rise from his seat, seeing it was the steward, and being curious to know what he had to say, placed himself between the hangings and the door, where he plainly overheard the steward's discourse to his master. "Sir," said he, "I ask 1,000 pardons for coming to disturb you in the height of your pleasure, but what I have to say is of such importance that I thought myself bound in duty to acquaint you with it. I come, sir, to make up my last accounts and to tell you that what I all along foresaw, and have warned you of, is at last come to pass. I have not the smallest piece left of all the sums I have received from you for your expenses, and the other funds you assigned me are all exhausted. The farmers and those that owe you rent have made it so plainly appear to me that you have assigned over to others what they held of you, that it is impossible for me to get any more from them on your account. Here are my books. If you please, examine them, and if you wish I should continue useful to you, assign me other funds, or else give me leave to quit your service." Nur ad-Din was so astonished at his statement that he gave him no answer. The friend, who had been listening all this while, and had heard every syllable of what the steward said, immediately came in and told the company what he had overheard. "It is your business, gentlemen," said he, "to make your use of this caution. For my part, I declare to you, this is the last visit I design ever to make Nur ad-Din." "Nay," replied they, "if matters go thus, we have as little business here as you, and for the future shall take care not to trouble him with our company." Nur ad-Din returned presently after. Notwithstanding all his efforts to appear gay to his guests, he could not so dissemble his concern, but they plainly perceived the truth of what they had heard. He was scarcely sat down in his place when one of his friends arose. "Sir," said he, "I am sorry I cannot have the honour of keeping your company any longer, and therefore I hope you will excuse my rudeness in leaving you so soon." "What urgent affair," demanded Nur ad-Din, "obliges you to be going so soon?" "My wife, sir," he replied, "is brought to bed to-day, and upon such an occasion you know a husband's company is always necessary." So, making a very low bow, he went away. A minute afterwards, a second took his leave, with another excuse. The rest did the same, one after another, till at last not one of the 10 friends that had hitherto kept Nur ad-Din company remained. End of section 32. Section 33 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 3. As soon as they were gone, Nur ad-Din, little suspecting the resolution they had formed never to see him again, went directly to the fair Persian's apartment, to whom he related all the steward had told him, and seemed extremely concerned at the ill state of his affairs. "Sir," said the fair Persian, "allow me to say you would never take my advice, but always managed your concerns after your own way, and now you see the fatal consequences. I find I was not mistaken when I presaged to what a miserable condition you would bring yourself at last. But what afflicts me the more is, that at present you do not see the worst of your misfortunes. Whenever I presumed freely to remonstrate with you, 'Let us be merry,' you replied, 'and improve the time that fortune offers us. Perhaps she will not always be so prodigal of her favours.' But was I to blame in telling you that we are ourselves the makers of our own fortunes by a prudent management of them? You would not hearken to me, and I was forced, however reluctantly, to let you go on." "I must own," replied Nur ad-Din, "I was extremely in the wrong in not following the advice which with such admirable prudence you gave me. It is true, I have spent my estate, but do you not consider it is among a chosen set of friends, whom I have long known, and who, I am persuaded, have more generosity and gratitude than to abandon me in distress?" "Sir," replied the fair Persian, "if you have nothing but the gratitude of your friends to depend on, your case is desperate, for, believe me, that hope is ill-grounded, and you will tell me so yourself in time." To this Nur ad-Din replied, "Charming Persian, I have a better opinion of my friends' generosity. Tomorrow I design to visit them all, before the usual time of their coming hither, and you shall see me return with a round sum that they will assist me with. I am resolved to alter my way of living, and with the money they lend me, to set up in some business." Next morning Nur ad-Din visited his 10 friends, who lived in the same street. He knocked at the first door, where one of the richest of them resided. A slave came to the door, but before he would open it, asked who was there. "Tell your master," said he to the slave, "it is Nur ad-Din, the late vizier's Khakan's son." The slave opened the door and shewed him into a hall, where he left him, in order to inform his master, who was in an inner room, that Nur ad-Din was come to wait on him. "Nur ad-Din!" cried he, in a disdainful tone, loud enough for him to hear, "go tell him I am not at home, and whenever he may come again, be sure you give him the same answer." The slave returned and told Nur ad-Din he thought his master was within, but was mistaken. Nur ad-Din came away in the greatest confusion. "Ah, base, ungrateful wretch!" cried he, "to treat me so to-day, after the vows and protestations of friendship that he made me yesterday." He went to another door, but that friend ordered his slave also to say he was gone out. He had the same answer at the third, and, in short, all the rest denied themselves, though every one was at home. Nur ad-Din now began in earnest to reflect with himself, and see the folly of relying upon the protestations of attachment that his false friends had solemnly made him in the time of his prosperity, when he could treat them sumptuously and load them with favours. "It is true," said he to himself, "that a fortunate man as I was may be compared to a tree laden with fruit, which, as long as there is any on its boughs, people will be crowding around and gathering, but as soon as it is stripped of all, they immediately leave it and go to another." He smothered his passion as much as possible while he was abroad, but no sooner was he got home than he gave a loose to his affliction, and discovered it to the fair Persian. The fair Persian, seeing him so extremely concerned, guessed he had not found his friend so ready to assist him as he expected. "Well, sir," said she, "are you now convinced of the truth of what I told you?" "Ah," cried he, Thou hast been too true a prophetess, for not one of them would know me, see me, or speak to me. Who could ever have believed that person so highly obliged to me, and on whom I have spent my estate, could have used me so ungratefully? I am distracted, and I fear I shall commit some action unworthy of myself, in the deplorable and desperate condition I am reduced to, unless you assist me with your prudent advice. Sir, replied the fair Persian, I see no other way of supporting yourself in your misfortunes, but selling off your slaves and furniture, and living on the money they produce, till heaven points out some other means to deliver you from your present misery. Nur ad-Din was loath to resort to this expedient, but what could he do in the necessitous circumstances to which he was reduced? He first sold off his slaves, those unprofitable mouths, which would have been a greater expense to him than in his present condition he could bear. He lived on the money for some time, and when it was spent, ordered his goods to be carried into the market-place, where they were sold for half their value, though there were among them several articles that had cost immense sums. Upon the produce of these he lived a considerable time, but this supply failing at last, he had nothing left by which he could raise any more money, of which he informed the fair Persian in the most sorrowful expressions. Nur ad-Din little expected the answer this prudent woman made him. Sir, said she, I am your slave, and the late vizier your father gave 10,000 pieces of gold for me. I know I am a little sunk in value since that time, but I believe I shall sell for pretty near that sum. Let me entreat you then instantly to carry me to the market, and expose me to sale, and with the money that you get for me, which will be very considerable, you may turn merchant in some city where you are not known, and by that means find a way of living, if not in splendour, yet with happiness and content. Lovely and adorable Persian, cried Nur ad-Din, is it possible you can entertain such a thought? Have I given you such slender proofs of my love, that you should think me capable of so base an action? But suppose me so vile a wretch, could I do it without being guilty of perjury, after the oath I have taken to my late father never to sell you? I would sooner die than break it and part with you, whom I love infinitely beyond myself, though by the unreasonable proposal you have made me, you shew me that your love is by no means reciprocal. Sir, replied the fair Persian, I am convinced that your passion for me is as sincere as you express, and heaven, who knows with what reluctance I have made this proposal, which induces you to think so hardly of me, is my witness, that mine is as great as yours. But to silence your reasons, I need only bid you remember that necessity has no law. I love you to that degree that it is impossible for you to love me more, and be assured that to what master soever I shall belong, my love for you will continue undiminished. And if you are ever able to redeem me, as I hope you may, it will be the greatest pleasure in the world to be restored to you again. I confess it is a fatal and cruel necessity to which we are driven, but I see no other way of freeing ourselves from the misery that involves us both. Nur ad-Din, convinced of the truth of what the fair Persian had said, and that there was no other way of avoiding a shameful poverty, was forced to yield to her proposal. Accordingly, he led her to the market where the women slaves are exposed to sale, with a regret that cannot easily be expressed. He applied himself to a broker named Hagi Hassan. Hagi Hassan, said he, here is a slave whom I mean to sell. What will they give for her? Hagi Hassan desired Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian to walk into a room, and when she had pulled off the veil that covered her face, Sir, said Hagi Hassan in surprise, if I am not mistaken, this is the slave your father, the late vizier, gave 10,000 pieces of gold for. Nur ad-Din assured him she was the same, and Hagi Hassan gave him some hopes of selling her at a high price, and promised to use all his art to raise her value as high as he could. Hagi Hassan and Nur ad-Din went out of the room, and Hagi Hassan locked the fair Persian in. He went immediately to the merchants, but they being busy in buying slaves from different countries, Greeks, Franks, Africans, Tartars, and others, he was forced to wait till the market was over. When the sale was ended, and the greatest part of them were got together again, "My masters," said he to them, with an air of gaiety in his looks and actions, "everything that is round is not a nut, everything that is long is not a fig, all that is red is not flesh, and all eggs are not fresh. It is true you have seen and bought a great many slaves in your lives, but you never yet saw one comparable to her I am going to tell you of. She is the very pearl of slaves. Come, follow me. You shall see her yourselves, and judge at what rate I shall cry her." The merchants followed Hagi Hassan into the apartment where he had left the fair Persian, and as soon as they beheld her, were so surprised at her beauty that they unanimously agreed 4,000 pieces of gold was the very lowest price they could set upon her. The merchants left the room, and Hagi Hassan, who came out with them, without going any further, proclaimed with a loud voice, 4,000 pieces of gold for a Persian slave." None of the merchants had yet offered anything, and were consulting together about what they might afford to give for her, when the vizier Sawi appeared. Perceiving Nur ad-Din in the market, he said to himself, "Nur ad-Din is certainly still making money of his goods," for he knew he had exposed them to sale, "and is come hither to buy a slave with the product." He advanced forward just as Hagi Hassan began to proclaim a second time, 4,000 pieces of gold for a Persian slave." The vizier Sawi, who concluded by the high price that the slave must be extraordinarily beautiful, was very desirous to see her. So, spurring his horse forward, he rode up to Hagi Hassan, who was surrounded by the merchants. "Open the door," said he, "and let me see the slave." It was not the custom to shew a slave to a particular person after the merchants had seen her and were treating for her, but none of them durst dispute their right with the vizier, and Hagi Hassan was obliged to open the door, and he made a sign to the fair Persian to come forward, that Sawi might see her without alighting from his horse. The vizier was astonished at the sight of so beautiful a slave, and knowing the broker's name, having formerly dealt with him, "Hagi Hassan," said he, "is it not at 4,000 pieces of gold that you cry her?" "Yes, sir," answered he, "the merchants just now agreed that I should put her up at that price. I wait their advance, and I question not but they will give a great deal more." "If no one offers more, I will give that sum," replied Sawi, looking at the merchants at the same time with a countenance that forbade them to advance the price. He was so universally dreaded that no one durst speak a word, even to complain of his encroaching upon their privilege. The vizier, having stayed some time, and finding none of the merchants outbid him, "What do you stay for?" said he to Hagi Hassan. "Inquire after the seller, and strike a bargain with him at 4,000 pieces of gold, or ask if he demands more." Hagi Hassan, having locked the chamber door, went to confer with Nur ad-Din. "Sir," said he to him, "I am very sorry to bring you the ill news of your slaves going to be sold for nothing." "How so?" replied Nur ad-Din. "Why, sir," continued Hagi Hassan, "you must know that the business at first went on well, for as soon as the merchants had seen your slave, they ordered me, without hesitation, to cry her at 4,000 pieces of gold. Accordingly I cried her at that price, but presently the vizier Sawi came, and his presence has stopped the mouths of all the merchants, who seemed disposed to raise her, at least to the same price your deceased father gave for her. Sawi will give no more than 4,000 pieces, and it is much against my inclination that I am come to tell you his despicable offer. The slave indeed is your own, but I will never advise you to part with her upon those terms, since you and everyone else are sensible of her being worth infinitely more. Besides, he is base enough to contrive a way to trick you out of the money." "Hagi Hassan," replied Nur ad-Din, "I am highly obliged to thee for thy advice. Do not think I will ever sell my slave to any enemy of our family. My necessities, indeed, are at present very great, but I would sooner die in the utmost poverty than consent to delivering her up to him. I have only one thing to beg of thee, who art skilful in all the turns and shifts of sail, that thou wouldst put me in a way to prevent the completion of the bargain." "Sir," said Hagi Hassan, "nothing is more easy. You must pretend that, being in a violent passion with your slave, you swore to expose her in the market, and for the sake of your oath, have now brought her hither, without any intention of selling her. This will satisfy everyone, and Saouy will have nothing to say against it. Come along with me then, and just as I am presenting her to Saouy, as if it were by your own consent, pull her to you, give her 2 or 3 blows, and send her home." "I thank thee for thy counsel," said Nur ad-Din, "and will make use of it." Hagi Hassan went back to the chamber, and having privately acquainted the fair Persian with their design, that she might not be surprised, took her by the hand and led her to the vizier Saouy, who was still on horseback at the door. "Sir," said he, "here is the slave. She is yours. Take her." The words were scarcely out of Hagi Hassan's mouth when Nur ad-Din, catching hold of the fair Persian, pulled her to him, and giving her a box on the ear, "Come hither, impertinence," said he, "and get you home again, for though your ill humour obliged me to swear I should bring you hither, yet I never intended to sell you. I have business for you to do yet, and it will be time enough to part with you when I have nothing else left." The conduct of Nur ad-Din put the vizier Saouy into a violent passion. "Miserable debauchee!" cried he, "wouldest thou have me believe thou hast anything else left to make money of but thy slave?" And at that same instant, spurring his horse directly against him, endeavoured to carry off the fair Persian. Nur ad-Din, nettled to the quick at the affront the vizier had put upon him, quitted the fair Persian, and laying hold of his horse's bridle, made him run 2 or 3 paces backwards. "Vile dotard!" said he to the vizier, "I would tear thy soul out of thy body this moment, were it not out of respect for the crowd of people here present." The vizier Saouy being hated by all, there was not one among them but was pleased to see Nur ad-Din mortify him, and by signs they gave him to understand that he might revenge himself upon him as much as he pleased, for nobody would interfere in their quarrel. Saouy endeavoured to force Nur ad-Din to quit the bridle, but he, being a lusty, vigorous man, and encouraged by those that stood by, pulled him off his horse, gave him several blows, and dashed his head against the stones, till it was all over blood. The slaves who waited upon the vizier would have drawn their scimitars and fallen upon Nur ad-Din, but the merchants interposing prevented them. "What do you mean?" said they to them. "Do you not see that one is a vizier, the other a vizier's son? Let them fight it out. Perhaps they will be reconciled one time or another, whereas if you had killed Nur ad-Din, your master with all his greatness could not have been able to protest you against the law." Nur ad-Din, having given over beating the vizier Saouy, left him in the mire, and taking the fair Persian, marched home with her, attended by the people, with shouts and acclamations for the action he had performed. The vizier, cruelly bruised with the blows he had received, made shift to get up with the assistance of his slaves, and had the mortification to see himself besmeared with blood and dirt. He leaned on the shoulders of 2 slaves, and in that condition went straight to the palace in the sight of all the people, with the greater confusion, because no one pitied him. As soon as he reached the king's apartment, he began to cry out and call for justice in a lamentable tone. the king ordered him to be admitted, and asked who it was that had abused and put him into that miserable plight. "Sire," cried Saouy, "it is the favour of your majesty, and being admitted into your sacred councils, that has occasioned me to be so barbarously treated." "Say no more of that," replied the king. "Only let me hear the whole story simply, and who the offender is, and if he is in the wrong, you may depend upon it he shall be severely punished." "Sire," said Saouy, telling the whole matter to his own advantage, "having occasion for a cook, I went to the market of women slaves to buy one. When I came thither, there was a slave just cried out at 4,000 pieces of gold. I ordered them to bring her before me, and I think my eyes never did nor will behold a more beautiful creature. I had no sooner examined her beauty with the highest satisfaction than I immediately asked to whom she belonged, and upon inquiry found that Nur ad-Din, son to the late Vizier Khacan, had the disposing of her. Your Majesty may remember that about 2 or 3 years ago you gave that Vizier 10,000 pieces of gold, strictly charging him to buy you a slave with that sum. The money indeed was laid out upon this very slave, but instead of bringing her to your Majesty, thinking his son deserved her better, he made him a present of her. Nur ad-Din, since his father's death, having wasted his whole fortune in riot and feasting, has nothing left but this slave, whom he at last resolved to part with, and she was to be sold in his name. I sent for him, and without mentioning anything of his father's prevarication, or rather treachery to your Majesty, I, in the civilest manner, said to him, Nur ad-Din, the merchants, I perceive, have put your slave up at 4,000 pieces of gold, and I question not, but in emulation of each other, they will raise the price considerably. Let me have her for the 4,000 pieces. I am going to buy her for the king, our lord and master. This will be a handsome opportunity of making your court to him, and his favour will be worth far more than the merchants can propose to give you." Instead of returning me a civil answer, the insolent wretch, beholding me with a fierce air, "Impotent villain," said he, "I would rather give my slave to a Jew for nothing than to thee for money." "Nur ad-Din," I replied, without passion, though I had some reason to be a little warm, "you do not consider that by talking in this manner you affront the king, who raised both your father and me to the honours we have enjoyed." This admonition, instead of softening him, only provoked him to a higher degree, so that, falling upon me like a madman, without regard to my age or rank, he pulled me off my horse and put me in this miserable plight. I beseech your Majesty to consider that it is on your account I have been so publicly affronted. End of Section 33. Section 34 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 4. The abused king, highly incensed against Nur ad-Din by this relation, so full of malice and artifice, discovered by his countenance the violence of his anger, and turning to the captain of his guards, who stood near him, "Take 40 of your soldiers," said he, "immediately plunder Nur ad-Din's house, and having ordered it to be razed to the ground, bring him and his slave to the presence." Before the captain of the guards was gone out of the king's presence, an officer belonging to the court, who overheard the order given, hastened out. His name was Sanjar, and he had been formerly a slave of the Vizier Khacan, who had introduced him at court, where by degrees he had raised himself. Sanjar, full of gratitude to his old master and affection for Nur ad-Din, whom he remembered a child, being no stranger to Saoui's hatred of Khacan's family, could not hear the order without concern. "This action," said he to himself, "may not be altogether so black as Saouy has represented it. He has prejudiced the king against him, who will certainly put him to death, without allowing him time to justify himself. He made so much haste to Nur ad-Din's house as to get thither soon enough to acquaint him with what had passed at court, and give him time to provide for his own and the fair Persian's safety. He knocked so violently at the door that Nur ad-Din, who had been a great while without any servant, ran immediately to open it. "My dear lord," said Sanjar, "there is no safety for you in Bussorah. You must lose no time, but depart hence this moment." "How so?" demanded Nur ad-Din. "What is the reason I must be gone so soon?" "Make haste away, sir," replied Sanjar, "and take your slave with you. In short, Saouy has been just now acquainting the king, after his own way of telling it, all that passed between you and him, and the captain of the guards will be here in an instant with 40 soldiers to seize you and the fair Persian. Take these 40 pieces of gold to assist you in repairing to some place of safety. I would give you more if I had it about me. Excuse my not staying any longer. I leave you with reluctance." Sanjar gave Nur ad-Din but just time to thank him, and departed. Nur ad-Din acquainted the fair Persian with the absolute necessity of their going that moment. She only put on her veil. They both stole out of the house, and were fortunate enough not only to get clear of the city, but also safely to arrive at the Euphrates, which was not far off, where they embarked in a vessel that lay ready to weigh anchor. As soon as they were on board, the captain came on deck amongst his passengers. "Children," said he to them, "are you all here? Have any of you any more business to do in the city? Or have you left anything behind you?" They were all there, they answered him, and ready, so that he might sail as soon as he pleased. When Nur ad-Din came aboard, the first question he asked was whither the vessel was bound, and being told for Baghdad, he rejoiced at it. The captain, having weighed anchor, set sail, and the vessel, with a very favourable wind, lost sight of Bussorah. The captain of the guards came to Nur ad-Din's house and knocked at the door, but no one answering, he ordered his soldiers to break it open, who immediately obeyed him and rushed in. They searched the house, but neither he nor the fair Persian were to be found. The captain of the guards made them inquire of the neighbours, and he himself asked if they had seen them lately. It was all in vain, for if they had seen him go out of his house, so universally beloved was Nur ad-Din by the people, that not one of them would have said the least word to his prejudice. While they were rifling the house and levelling it to the ground, he went to acquaint the king with the news. "Look for them," said he, "everywhere, for I am resolved to have them." The captain of the guards made a second search, and the king dismissed the vizier Saouy with honour. "Go home," said he, "trouble yourself no further to punish Nur ad-Din. I will revenge your injuries." Without delay, the king ordered to be proclaimed throughout the whole city a reward of 1,000 pieces of gold for any person that should apprehend Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian, also a severe punishment upon those who should conceal them. No tidings, however, could be heard of them, and the vizier Saouy had only the comfort of seeing the king espouse his quarrel. In the meantime, Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian, after a prosperous voyage, landed safe at Baghdad. As soon as the captain came within sight of that city, pleased that his voyage was at an end, "Rejoice, my children!" cried he to the passengers. "Yonder is that great and wonderful city, where there is a perpetual concourse of people from all parts of the world. There you shall meet with innumerable crowds, and never feel the extremity of cold in winter, nor the excess of heat in summer, but enjoy an eternal spring with all its flowers, and the delicious fruits of autumn." When the vessel came to anchor, a little below the city, the passengers went ashore, each to their respective place of abode. Nur ad-Din gave the captain 5 pieces of gold for his passage, and went ashore also with the fair Persian, but, being a perfect stranger in Baghdad, was at a loss for a lodging. They rambled a considerable time along the gardens that bordered on the Tigris, and keeping close to one of them that was enclosed with a very long wall, at the end of it they turned into a street well paved, where they perceived a magnificent gateway and a fountain near it. The inner door happened to be shut, but the portal was open, in which there was an estrade on each side. "This is a very convenient place for us," said Nur ad-Din to the fair Persian. "Night comes on apace, and though we have eaten nothing since our landing, I am for passing the night here, and tomorrow we shall have time enough to look for a lodging." "Sir," replied the fair Persian, "you know your wishes are mine. Let us go no further, since you are willing to stay here." Each of them having drunk a draught of water at the fountain, they laid themselves down upon one of the estrades, and after a little chat, being soothed by the agreeable murmur of the water, fell asleep. The garden belonged to the Caliph, and in the middle of it there was a pavilion called the Pavilion of Pictures, because its chief ornaments were pictures after the Persian manner, drawn by the most celebrated painters in Persia, whom the Caliph had sent for on purpose. The stately hall within this pavilion was lighted by 80 arches, and a lustre in each, but these were lighted only when the Caliph came thither to spend the evening. On such occasions they made a glorious illumination, and could be seen at a great distance in the country on that side, and by the great part of the city. The office of keeper of this pleasure-house was at this time held by a very aged officer, named Sheikh Ibrahim, whom the Caliph, for some important service, had put into that employment, with strict charge not to let all sorts of people in, but especially to suffer no one either to sit or lie down on the estrades at the outward door, that they might always be clean, and whenever he found anybody there, to punish them severely. Some business had obliged this officer to go abroad, and he was not yet returned. When he came back, there was just daylight enough for him to discern 2 persons asleep upon one of the estrades, with their heads under a piece of linen, to defend them from the gnats. "Very well," said Sheikh Ibrahim to himself, "these people disobey the Caliph's orders, but I will take care to teach them better manners." Upon this he opened the door very softly, and a moment after returned with a cane in his hand, and his sleeve tucked up to the elbow. He was just going to lay on them both with all his might, but, withholding his arm, began to reason with himself after this manner. "Thou wast going, without reflection, to strike these people, who perhaps are strangers, destitute of a lodging, and utterly ignorant of the Caliph's order, so that it would be advisable to know first who they are." Upon this he gently lifted up the linen that covered their heads, and was astonished to see a young man so well shaped, and a young woman so beautiful. He then waked Nur ad-Din by pulling him softly by the feet. Nur ad-Din, lifting up his head and seeing an old man with a long white beard standing at his feet, got up, and throwing himself upon his knees, and taking his hand, kissed it. "Good father," said he, "heaven preserve you." "What do you want, my son?" replied Sheikh Ibrahim. "Who are you, and whence come you?" "We are strangers newly arrived," answered Nur ad-Din, "and would fain tarry here till tomorrow." "This is not a proper place for you," said Sheikh Ibrahim. "Come in with me, and I will find one fitter for you to sleep in than this, and the sight of the garden, which is very fine, will please you when you see it tomorrow by daylight." "Is this garden your own?" asked Nur ad-Din. "Yes," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, smiling. "It is an inheritance left me by my father. Pray walk in, for I am sure you will not repent seeing it." Nur ad-Din rose to thank Sheikh Ibrahim for the civility he had strewn, as did afterwards the fair Persian, and they entered the garden. Sheikh Ibrahim locked the door, and going before, led them to a spot from whence, at one view, they might see the disposition, grandeur, and beauty of the whole. Nur ad-Din had seen very fine gardens, but never any comparable to this. Having satisfied his curiosity, as he was walking in one of the walks, he turned about to the officer and asked him his name. As soon as he had told him it was Sheikh Ibrahim, "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he to him, "I must confess this is a charming garden indeed. Heaven send you long to enjoy the pleasures of it. We cannot sufficiently thank you for the favour you have done by showing us a place so well worth seeing. However, it is but just that we should make you some amends for your kindness. Here are 2 pieces of gold. Take them, and get us something to eat, that we may be merry together." At the sight of the 2 pieces of gold, Sheikh Ibrahim, who was a great admirer of that metal, laughed in his sleeve. He took them, and leaving Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian by themselves, went to provide what was necessary, for he was alone. Said he to himself with great joy, "These are generous people. I should have done very wrong if, through imprudence, I had ill-treated and driven them away. A 10th part of the money will suffice to treat them, and the rest I will keep for my pains." While Sheikh Ibrahim was gone to fetch something for his own supper, as well as for his guests, Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian walked up and down the garden, till at last they came to the pavilion of pictures. They stood a while to admire its wonderful structure, size, and loftiness, and after taking a full view of it, on every side, went up many steps of fine white marble to the hall door, which they found locked. They were but just returned to the bottom of the steps when Sheikh Ibrahim arrived, loaded with provisions. "Sheikh Ibrahim," said Nur ad-Din in great surprise, "you did not tell us that this was your garden?" "I did," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, "and do so still." "And does this magnificent pavilion also belong to you?" Sheikh Ibrahim was staggered at this unexpected question. "If," said he to himself, "I should say it is none of mine, they will ask me how I can be master of the garden and not of the pavilion." As he had made them believe the garden was his, he said the same of the pavilion. "My son," said he, "the pavilion is not distinct from the garden, but they both belong to me." "If so," said Nur ad-Din, "since you invite us to be your guests tonight, do us the favour to shew us the inside of it, for if we may judge by the outward appearance, it must certainly be extraordinarily magnificent." It would have been a great piece of incivility in Sheikh Ibrahim to refuse this favour after what he had already done. Moreover, he considered that the Caliph not having given him notice, according to his usual custom, it was likely he would not be there that night, and therefore resolved to treat his guests and sup with them in the pavilion. He laid the provisions on the first step, while he went to his apartment for the key. He soon returned with a light and opened the door. Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian entered the hall, and were never tired with admiring the beauty and richness of the place. Indeed, without saying anything of the pictures, which were admirably well drawn, the sofas were very noble and costly, and besides lustres suspended from every arc, there was between each silver branch supporting a wax candle. Nur ad-Din could not behold these glorious objects without recollecting his former splendour and sighing. In the meantime, Sheikh Ibrahim was getting supper ready, and the cloth being laid upon a sofa, and everything in order, Nur ad-Din, the fair Persian, and he sat down and ate together. When supper was finished, and they had washed their hands, Nur ad-Din opened a lattice, and calling the fair Persian to him, "Come hither," said he, "and with me admire the charming prospect and beauty of the garden by moonlight. Nothing can be more agreeable." She came to him, and they both enjoyed the view, while Sheikh Ibrahim was busy in taking away the cloth. When Sheikh Ibrahim came to his guests again, Nur ad-Din asked him whether he had any liquor to treat them with. "What liquor would you have?" replied Sheikh Ibrahim. "Sherbet? I have the best in the world, but sherbet, you know, my son, is never drunk after supper." "I know that very well," said Nur ad-Din. "It is not sherbet, but another sort of liquor that we ask you for, and I am surprised at your not understanding me." "It is wine that you mean?" said Sheikh Ibrahim. "You guess right," replied Nur ad-Din, "and if you have any, oblige us with a bottle. You know a bottle after supper is a very proper companion to spend the hours with till bedtime." "Heaven defend me from keeping wine in my house," cried Sheikh Ibrahim, "and from ever coming to a place where any is found. A man who, like me, has been a pilgrimage 4 times to Mecca, has renounced wine for ever." "You would do us a singular kindness," said Nur ad-Din, "in getting a little for our own drinking, and if it be not too much trouble, I will put you in a way how you may do it, without going into a vinter's shop, or so much as laying your hand upon the vessel that contains it." "Upon that condition I will do it," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, "only let me know what I am to do." "Why then," said Nur ad-Din, "we just now saw an ass tied at the entrance of your garden, which certainly must be yours, and which you may make use of in this extremity. Here are 2 pieces of gold more. Take them and lead your ass with the panniers to the next vinters. You may stand at as great a distance as you please. Do but give something to the first person that comes by, and desire him to go with your ass and procure 2 pitchers of wine. Put one in one pannier, in another, which he must pay for out of the money you give him, and so let him bring the ass back to you. You will have nothing to do but to drive the beast hither before you. We will take the wine out of the panniers. By this mean you will do nothing that will give you any scruple." The 2 last pieces of gold that Sheikh Ibrahim was going to receive wrought wonderfully upon his mind. "Ah, my son," cried he, "you have an excellent contrivance, and had it not been for your invention, I should never have thought of this way of getting you some wine without any scruple of conscience." Away he went to execute the orders, which he did in a little time, and upon his return, Nur ad-Din, taking the pitchers out of the panniers, carried them into the hall. Sheikh Ibrahim, having led the ass to the place from whence he took him, came back again. "Sheikh Ibrahim," said Nur ad-Din, "we cannot enough thank you for the trouble we have already given you, but we want something yet." "What is that?" replied Sheikh. "What more service can I do you?" "We have no cups to drink out of," said Nur ad-Din, "and a little fruit, if you had any, would be very acceptable." "Do but say what you have a mind to," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, "and you shall have everything to your heart's content." Down went Sheikh Ibrahim, and in a short time spread a carpet for them with beautiful porcelain dishes full of all sorts of delicious fruits, besides gold and silver cups to drink out of, and, having asked them if they wanted anything else, he withdrew, though they pressed him earnestly to stay. Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian sat down again and drank each cup. They were pleased with the wine, which was excellent. "Well, my dear," said Nur ad-Din to the fair Persian, "are we not the most fortunate persons in the world, after so many dangers, to meet with so charming and agreeable a place? Let us be merry and think no more on the hardships of our voyage. Can my happiness be greater in this world than to have you on one side of me and my glass on the other?" They drank freely and diverted themselves with agreeable conversation, each singing a song. Both having very fine voices, but especially the fair Persian, their singing attracted Sheikh Ibrahim, who had stood hearkening a great while on the steps without discovering himself. He could contain himself no longer, but thrusting his head in at the door, "Courage, sir," said he to Nur ad-Din, whom he took to be quite drunk. "I am glad to see you so pleased." "Ah, Sheikh Ibrahim," cried Nur ad-Din, turning to him, "you are a glorious man, and we are extremely obliged to you. We dare not ask you to drink a cup, but walk in, come, sit down, and let us have the honour at least of your company." Go on, said Sheikh Ibrahim. "The pleasure of hearing your songs is sufficient for me." Upon this he immediately retired. The fair Persian, perceiving Sheikh Ibrahim through one of the windows standing upon the steps, told Nur ad-Din of it. "Sir," said she, "you see what an aversion he has for wine, yet I question not in the least to make him drink, if you will do as I would have you." Nur ad-Din asked her what it was. "Do but say the word," replied he, "and I am ready to do what you please. Prevail with him then only to come in, and bear us company. Some time after fill up a bumper, and give it him. If he refuses, drink it yourself. Pretend to be asleep, and leave the rest to me." Nur ad-Din understood the fair Persian's design, and called to Sheikh Ibrahim, who came again to the door. "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he, "we are your guests. You have entertained us in the most obliging manner, and will now refuse our solicitations to honour us with your company? We do not ask you to drink, but only the favour of seeing you." Sheikh Ibrahim, being at last prevailed upon, came into the hall and sat down on the edge of a sofa nearest to the door. "You do not sit well there," said Nur ad-Din, "and we cannot have the honour of seeing you. Pray come nearer and sit you down by the lady. She will like it much." "I will obey you," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, so coming forward, simpering, to think he should be seated near so beautiful a creature, he placed himself at some distance from the fair Persian. Nur ad-Din desired a song of her, in return for the honour Sheikh Ibrahim had done them, and she sung one that charmed him. End of section 34. Section 35 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 35. When the fair Persian had ended her song, Nur ad-Din poured out a cup of wine and presented it to Sheikh Ibrahim. "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he, "I entreat you, drink this to our healths." "Sir," replied he, starting back as if he abhorred the very sight of the wine, "I beseech you to excuse me. I have already told you that I have forsworn the use of wine these many years." "Then, since you will not drink to our healths," said Nur ad-Din, "give me leave to drink yours." While Nur ad-Din was drinking, the fair Persian cut half an apple and presented it to Sheikh Ibrahim. "Though you refuse drinking," said she, "yet I believe you will not refuse tasting this apple. It is very excellent." Sheikh Ibrahim had no power to refuse it from so fair a hand, but taking it with a very low bow, put it in his mouth. She said a great many pleasant things on the occasion, and Nur ad-Din, falling back upon a sofa, pretended to fall fast asleep. The fair Persian presently advanced towards Sheikh Ibrahim, and speaking in a low voice, "Look at him," said she. "Thus in all our merry parties he constantly serves me, and no sooner has he drunk a cup or two, but he falls asleep, and leaves me alone. But I hope you will have the goodness to keep me company till he awakes." At this the fair Persian took a cup, and filling it with wine, offered it to Sheikh Ibrahim. "Here," said she, "drink of this to my health. I am going to pledge to you." Sheikh Ibrahim made a great many difficulties, and begged her to excuse him from drinking, but she pressed him so that, overcome by her charms and entreaties, he took the cup and drank off every drop of the wine. The good old man loved a chirping cup to his heart, but was ashamed to drink amongst strangers. He often went to the tavern in private, as many other people do, and he did not take the precaution recommended, but went directly where he was well known, knights serving him instead of a cloak, and saved the money that Nur ad-Din had ordered him to give to the messenger who was to have gone for the wine. While Sheikh Ibrahim was eating fruit after his draught, the fair Persian filled him out another, which he received with less difficulty than the former, but made none at all at the third. In short, a fourth was quaffing, when Nur ad-Din started up from his pretended sleep, and bursting out into a violent fit of laughter, and looking at him, "Ha ha!" said he, "Sheikh Ibrahim, have I caught you at last? Did you not tell me you had forsworn wine? and now you have drunk it all up from me." Sheikh Ibrahim, not expecting to be surprised, blushed a little. However, that did not spoil his draught. But when he had done, "Sir," said he, laughing, "if there is any crime in what I have done, it lies at this fair lady's door, not mine, for who could possibly resist so many charms?" The fair Persian, who perfectly understood Nur ad-Din, took Sheikh Ibrahim's part. "Let him talk," said she. "Sheikh Ibrahim, take no notice of him, but let us drink on and be merry." A while after, Nur ad-Din filled out a cup for himself and the fair Persian, but when Sheikh Ibrahim saw that Nur ad-Din had forgotten him in his turn, he took his cup and, presenting it to the fair Persian, "Madam," said he, "do you suppose I cannot drink as well as you?" At these words, Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian laughed very heartily. They poured him out some wine, and sat laughing, chatting, and drinking till near midnight. At about that hour, the fair Persian began to notice that there was but one candle on the carpet. "Sheikh Ibrahim," said she to the good old officer, "you have afforded us but one candle, when there are so many wax lights yonder. Pray do us the favour to light some of them, that we may see a little better what we are doing." Sheikh Ibrahim, making use of the liberty that wine inspires when it gets into the head, and not caring to be interrupted in his discourse, bade the fair Persian light them for herself. "It is fitter for a young person like you to do it," said he, "than for me, but be sure not to light above 5 or 6. Up rose the fair Persian immediately, and taking a wax candle in her hand, lighted it with that which stood upon the carpet, and without any regard to Sheikh Ibrahim's order, lighted up the whole 80. By and by, while Sheikh Ibrahim was entertaining the fair Persian with some discourse, Nur ad-Din took his turn to desire him to light up some of the candles in the lustres, not taking notice that all the wax lights were already in a blaze. "Certainly," replied Sheikh Ibrahim, "you must be very lazy, or less vigorous than I am, that you are not able to light them yourself. Get you gone and light them, but be sure you light no more than 3. To work he went, but instead of that number, he lighted them all, and opened the shutters of the 80 windows, before Sheikh Ibrahim, who was deeply engaged with the fair Persian, knew anything of the matter. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, being not yet gone to rest, was in a room of his palace on the river Tigris, from whence he could command a view both of the garden and the pavilion. He accidentally opened the casement, and was extremely surprised at seeing the pavilion illuminated, and at first, by the greatness of the light, thought the city was on fire. The Grand Vizier Jafir was still with him, waiting for his going to rest. The Caliph, in a great rage, called the Vizier to him. "Careless Vizier," said he, come hither, look at the pavilion of pictures, and tell me the reason of its being illuminated at this hour, now I am not there." The Grand Vizier at this account fell into a violent trembling, but when he came nearer, and with his own eyes saw the truth of what the Caliph had told him, he was more alarmed than before. Some excuse must be made to appease the Caliph's anger. "Commander of the true believers," said he, "all that I can say to your Majesty about this matter is, that some 5 or 6 days ago, Sheikh Ibrahim came to acquaint me that he had a design to assemble the ministers of his mosque, to assist at a ceremony he was ambitious of performing in honor of your Majesty's auspicious reign. I asked him if I could be any way serviceable to him in this affair, upon which he entreated me to get leave of your Majesty to perform the ceremony in the pavilion. I sent him away with leave to hold the assembly, telling him I would take care to acquaint your Majesty with it, and I ask pardon for having quite forgotten it. Sheikh Ibrahim," continued he, "has certainly made choice of this day for the ceremony, and after treating the ministers of his mosque, was willing to indulge them with the sight of this illumination." Jafir, said the Caliph, with a tone that plainly shewed his anger was a little mollified, according to your own account, you have committed 3 faults. The first, in giving Sheikh Ibrahim leave to perform this ceremony in my pavilion, for a person in such an office is not worthy of so great an honour. The second, in not acquainting me with it, and the third, in not diving into the bottom of the good old man's intention. For my part, I am persuaded he only did it to try if he could get any money towards bearing the charge of it, but that never came into your head. The Grand Vizier, overjoyed to hear the Caliph put the matter upon that footing, very willingly owned the faults he reproached him with, and freely confessed he was to blame in not giving Sheikh Ibrahim a few pieces of gold. Since the case is so, added the Caliph, it is just that thou shouldest be punished for thy mistakes, but thy punishment shall be light. Thou shalt spend the remainder of the night, as I mean to do, with these honest people whose company I shall be well pleased with, and while I am putting on a citizen's habit, go thou and disguise thyself with Mesroor, and come both of you along with me. The Vizier would have persuaded him it was late, and that all the company would be gone before he could get thither, but the Caliph said he would positively go. The Vizier, who knew that not a syllable of what he had said was true, began to be in great consternation, but there was no reply to be made, and go he must. The Caliph then, disguised like a citizen, with the Grand Vizier Jafir and Mesroor, chief of the eunuchs, stole out of the palace together. They rambled through the streets of Baghdad till they came to the garden. The door, through the carelessness of Sheikh Ibrahim, was open, he having forgotten to shut it when he came back with the wine. The Caliph was very angry at this. "Jafir," said he to the Grand Vizier, "what excuse have you for the doors being open at this unseasonable hour? Is it possible that Sheikh Ibrahim makes a custom of leaving it thus all night? I rather believe the hurry of the feast has been the occasion of this neglect." The Caliph went into the garden, and when he came to the pavilion, resolving not to go into the hall till he knew what was doing, consulted with the Grand Vizier whether it was not his best way to climb up into one of the trees that was near, to observe what was going forward. The Grand Vizier, casting his eyes upon the door, perceived it stood half open, and told the Caliph. It seems Sheikh Ibrahim had left it so, when he was prevailed upon to come in and bear Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian company. The Caliph, laying aside his first design, stole softly up to the hall door, which standing half open he could see all the company within, without being discovered himself. But how was he surprised when he saw a lady of incomparable beauty and a handsome young man sitting, with Sheikh Ibrahim by them. Sheikh Ibrahim held a cup in his hand. "My fair lady," said he to the fair Persian, "a true toper never drinks without singing a song first. If you please to hear, I will give you one of my best songs." Sheikh Ibrahim sung, and the Caliph was the more surprised, because till that moment he never knew of his drinking wine, but always took him for a grave solid man, as he seemed to be to outward appearance. The Caliph retired from the door with the same caution as he had made his approaches to it, and coming to the Grand Vizier, who was standing on the steps a little lower, "Come in," said he to him, "and see if those within are the ministers of the mosque, as you would have made me believe." By the tone of his voice in which the Caliph spoke these last words, the Vizier understood that things went ill on his side. However, he went up the steps, but when he had peeped in at the door and saw the 3 sitting in that condition, he trembled for his life. He returned to the Caliph, but in such confusion that he knew not what to say. "What riotous doings are here?" said the Caliph to him. "Who are these people that have presumed to take the liberty of diverting themselves in my garden and pavilion? And how durst Sheikh Ibrahim give them admittance and partake of the diversion with them?" I must, however, confess I never saw two persons more beautiful or better paired in my life, and therefore, before I discover my anger, I will inform myself better, and know who they are and the reason of their being here." He went to the door again to observe them more narrowly, and the vizier, who followed, stood behind him while he fixed his eyes upon them. They both plainly heard every word that Sheikh Ibrahim said to the fair Persian. "Is there anything, my charming lady, wanting to render the pleasure of the evening more complete?" "Nothing but a lute," replied the fair Persian, "and methinks if you could get me one, all would be well." "Can you play upon it?" said Sheikh Ibrahim. "Fetch me one," replied the fair Persian, "and you shall hear whether I can or not." Sheikh Ibrahim, without stirring very far from his place, took a lute out of a press and presented it to the fair Persian, who began to tune it. The Caliph, in the meantime, turning to the Grand Vizier, "Jafir," said he, "the young lady is going to play upon the lute, and if she performs well, I will forgive her, and the young man, for her sake. But as for thee, I will have thee impaled." "Commander of the true believers," replied the Grand Vizier, "if that is your intention, I wish to God she may play ill." "Why so?" said the Caliph. "Because," replied the Grand Vizier, "the longer we live in this world, the more reason we shall have to comfort ourselves with the hopes of dying in good sociable company." The Caliph, who loved a repartee, began to laugh at this, and putting his ear to the opening of the door, listened to hear the fair Persian play. The fair Persian began in such a style that from the first moment of her touching the lute, the Caliph perceived she did it with a masterly hand. Afterwards, accompanying the lute with her voice, which was admirably fine, she sung and played with so much skill and sweetness that the Caliph was quite ravished to hear her. As soon as the fair Persian had finished her song, the Caliph went down the steps, and the Vizier followed him. When he came to the bottom, "I never," said he to the Vizier, "heard a more charming voice, or a lute better touched. Isaac, whom I thought the most skilful player in the world, does not come up to her. I am so charmed with her music that I will go in and hear her play before me. We must, therefore, consider how I can do it." "Commander of the true believers," said the Grand Vizier, "if you should go in and Sheikh Ibrahim chanced to know you, he would infallibly die with the fright." "It is that which hurts me," replied the Caliph, "and I should be loth to be the occasion of his death after so many years of service. A thought is just come into my head that may succeed. Stay here with Mesrour and wait for me in the next walk." The neighbourhood of the tigers had given the Caliph an opportunity to turning the stream under a stately bridge into his garden, through a piece of water whither the choicest fish of the river used to retire. The fishermen knew it well, but the Caliph had expressly charged Sheikh Ibrahim not to suffer any of them to come near it. However, that night a fisherman passing by the garden door, which the Caliph had left open as he found it, made use of the opportunity, and going in, went directly to the canal. The fisherman immediately fell to work with his nets, and was just ready to draw them, when the Caliph, fearing what would make the effect of Sheikh Ibrahim's negligence, but willing to make use of it to bring his design about, came to the same place. The fisherman, in spite of his disguise, knew him, and throwing himself at his feet, humbly implored his pardon, and excused himself on account of his poverty. "Rise," said the Caliph, "and be not afraid, only draw your nets, that I may see what fish you have got." The fisherman, recovered of his fright, quickly obeyed the Caliph's orders. He drew out 5 or 6 very large fishes, and the Caliph, choosing the 2 biggest, tied them together by the head with a twig of a tree. "After this," said he to the fisherman, "give me thy clothes and take mine." The exchange was soon made, and the Caliph, being dressed like a fisherman, even to his boots and turban, "Take thy nets," said he to the fisherman, "and get thee about thy business." When the fisherman, well pleased with his good fortune, was gone, the Caliph, taking the 2 fishes in his hand, went to look after the Grand Vizier and Mesrour. He first met Jaffier, who, not knowing him, asked what he wanted, and bade him go about his business. The Caliph fell a-laughing, by which the Vizier, recognizing him, "Commander of the true believers," said he, "is it possible it can be you? I knew you not, and I ask 1,000 pardons for my rudeness. You are so disguised that you may venture into the hall without any fear of being discovered by Sheikh Ibrahim." "Stay you here with Mesrour," replied the Caliph, "while I go and play my part." The Caliph went up to the hall and knocked at the door. Nur ad-Din, hearing him first, told Sheikh Ibrahim of it, who asked who was there. The Caliph opened the door, and stepping a little way into the hall to shew himself, "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he, "I am the fisherman Karim, who, being informed of your design to treat some of your friends, have brought you 2 very fine fishes, fresh caught, to ask if you have any occasion for them." Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian were pleased to hear him name fish. "Pray," said the latter to Sheikh Ibrahim, "let him come in, that we may look at them." Sheikh Ibrahim, by this time, was incapable of asking this counterfeit fisherman how or which way he came thither, his whole thought being only to oblige the fair Persian. With much ado he turned his head towards the door, being quite drunk, and in a stammering tone, calling to the Caliph, whom he took to be a fisherman. "Come hither, thou nightly thief," said he, "and let us see what thou hast got." The Caliph went forwards, and counterfeiting all the actions of a fisherman, presented the 2 fishes. "These are very fine ones indeed," said the fair Persian, "and if they were well dressed and seasoned, I should be glad to eat some of them." "The lady is in the right," answered Sheikh Ibrahim. "But what can you do with your fish unless it were dressed? Go dress it thyself, and bring it to us. Thou wilt find everything necessary in my kitchen." The Caliph went back to the Grand Vizier. "Jaffier," said he, "I have been very well received, but they want the fish to be dressed." "I will take care to dress it myself," said the Grand Vizier, "and they shall have it in a moment." "Nay," replied the Caliph, "so eager am I to accomplish my design that I will take that trouble for myself, for since I have personated the fisherman so well, surely I can play the cook for once. In my younger days I dealt a little in cookery, and always came off with credit." So saying, he went directly towards Sheikh Ibrahim's lodgings, and the Grand Vizier and Mesrour followed him. They all fell to work, and though Sheikh Ibrahim's kitchen was not very large, yet there was everything in it that they wanted. The fish was quickly cooked, and the Caliph served it up, putting to everyone's place a lemon to squeeze into the sauce, if they thought proper. They all ate very heartily, but especially Nur ad-Din and the fair Persian, and the Caliph stood before them. As soon as the repast was over, Nur ad-Din, looking at the Caliph, "Fisherman," said he, "there never was better fish eaten, and you have done us the greatest favour." At the same time, putting his hand into his bosom, and pulling out a purse of 30 pieces of gold, the remainder of 40 that Sanjar, the officer of the king of Basra, had given him just upon his departure, "Take it," said he to him. "If I had any more, thou shouldest have it. Had I known thee in my prosperity, I would have taken care to secure thee from want. Do not refuse the small present I make thee, but accept of it as kindly as if it were much greater." The Caliph took the purse, thanked Nur ad-Din, and perceiving by the weight that it contained gold, "Sir," said he to him, "I cannot enough thank you for your liberality, and I think myself very fortunate in having to do with a person of your generosity. But before I take my leave, I have a favour to ask which I beg you not to deny me. Yonder is a lute, which makes me believe that the lady understands playing upon it, and if you can prevail with her to play but one tune, I shall go away perfectly satisfied, for a lute, sir, is an instrument I am particularly fond of. End of section 35. Section 36 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. The Story of Nur ad-Din and the Fair Persian, Part 6. Fair Persian, said Nur ad-Din, immediately addressing himself to her, I ask that favour of you, and I hope you will not refuse me. She took up the lute without more entreaties, and, putting it presently in tune, played and sung with such an air as charmed the very soul of the Caliph. Afterwards she played upon the lute without singing, but with so much strength and softness as to transport him into an ecstasy. When the fair Persian had given over playing, the Caliph cried out, What a voice! What a hand! What skill! Was there ever finer singing or better playing upon the lute? Never was there any seen or heard like it. Nur ad-Din, who was accustomed to give all that belonged to him to persons who praised him, said, Fisherman, I found thou hast some taste for music. Since thou art so delighted with her performance, she is thine. I make thee a present of her. At the same time he rose up, and taking his robe, which he had laid by, was going away, and leaving the Caliph, whom he believed to be no other than a fisherman, in possession of the fair Persian. The fair Persian was extremely surprised at Nur ad-Din's liberality. She took hold of him, and looking tenderly at him, Whither, sir, said she, are you going? Sit down in your place, I entreat you, and hearken to what I am going to sing and play. He did as she desired him, and then the fair Persian, touching the lute and looking upon him with tears in her eyes, sung some verses that she had made extempore, to reproach him with his indifference, and the easiness as well as cruelty with which he resigned her to Karim. She only hinted, without explaining herself any further to a fisherman, for she, as well as Nur ad-Din, was ignorant of his being the Caliph. When she had done playing, she put the lute down by her, and clapped the handkerchief to her face to hide the tears she could not repress. Nur ad-Din made no answer to all these reproaches, but by his silence seemed to declare he did not repent of what he had done. The Caliph, surprised at what he had heard, said, Sir, as far as I see, this beautiful, rare, and accomplished lady, of whom so generously you have made me a present, is your slave? It is very true, Karim, replied Nur ad-Din, and thou wouldest be more surprised than thou art now, should I tell thee all the misfortunes that have happened to me upon her account. Ah, I beseech you, sir, replied the Caliph, still behaving like a fisherman, oblige me so far as to let me hear part of your story. Nur ad-Din, who had already obliged him in several things of more consequence, was so complacent as to relate the whole story to him. He began with the vizier his father's buying the fair Persian for the king of Basra, and omitted nothing of what he had done, or what had happened to him, from that time to their arrival at Baghdad, and to the very moment he was talking to him. When Nur ad-Din had ended his story, And whither are you going now? asked the Caliph. Where heaven shall direct me, answered Nur ad-Din. If you will believe me, replied the Caliph, you shall go no further, but on the contrary, you must return to Basra. I will write a short letter, which you shall give the king in my name. You shall see upon the reading it, he will give you a very handsome reception, and nobody will dare to speak against you. Karim, said Nur ad-Din, what thou hast told me is very singular. I never heard that a poor fisherman, as thou art, had any correspondence with a king. Be not astonished at that, replied the Caliph. You must know that we both studied together under the same masters, and were always the best friends in the world. It is true, fortune has not been equally favourable to us. She has made him a king and me a fisherman, but this inequality has not lessened our friendship. He has often expressed a readiness and desire to advance my fortune, but I always refused, and am better pleased with the satisfaction of knowing that he will never deny me whatever I ask for the service and advantage of my friends. Let me do it, and you shall see the success." Nur ad-Din consented to what the Caliph had proposed, and there being everything necessary for writing in the hall, the Caliph wrote a letter to the King of Bassorah, at the top of which he placed his form, in the name of the most merciful God, to shew he would be absolutely obeyed. Harun al-Rashid, son of Mahdi, sends the letter to Zinebi, his cousin. As soon as Nur ad-Din, son to the late Vizier Khacan, the bearer, has delivered you this letter, and you have read it, pull off the royal vestments, put them on his shoulders, and place him in thy seat without fail. Farewell." The Caliph folded up the letter, sealed it, and giving it to Nur ad-Din without saying anything of what was in it, "Go," said he, "embark immediately in a vessel that is ready to go off, as there did constantly every day at the same hour. You may sleep when you are aboard." Nur ad-Din took the letter and departed with the little money he had about him, when Sanjir gave him his purse, and the fair Persian, distracted with grief at his departure, retired to one of the sofas and wept bitterly. Nur ad-Din was scarcely gone out of the hall when Sheikh Ibrahim, who had been silent during the whole transaction, looking steadfastly upon the Caliph, whom he still took for the fisherman Karim, "Hark," said he, "Karim, thou hast brought us 2 fishes that are worth 20 pieces of copper at most, and thou hast got a purse and a slave. But dost thou think to have all for thyself? I here declare that I will go halves with thee in the slave, and as for the purse, shew me what is in the inside. If it is silver, thou shalt have 1 piece for thyself, but if it is gold, I will have it all, and give thee in exchange some pieces of copper, which I have in my purse." The Caliph, before his serving up the fish, had dispatched the Grand Vizier to his palace, with orders to get 4 slaves with a rich habit, and to wait on the other side of the pavilion till he gave a signal with his finger against the window. The Grand Vizier performed his commission, and he, Mesrour, and the 4 slaves waited at the appointed place, expecting the sign. The Caliph, still personating the fisherman, answered Sheikh Ibrahim boldly, "I know not what there is in the purse. Gold or silver, you shall freely go my halves, but as to the slave, I will have her all to myself, and if you will not accept these conditions, you shall have nothing." Sheikh Ibrahim, enraged to the last degree at this insolence, considering him only as a fisherman, snatched up one of the china dishes which were on the table, and flung it at the Caliph's head. The Caliph easily avoided the blow, being thrown by a person in liquor, but the dish, striking against the wall, was dashed into 1,000 pieces. Sheikh Ibrahim grew more enraged at having missed his aim, and catching up the candle that stood upon the table, rose from his seat and went staggering down a pair of back stairs to look for a cane. The Caliph took this opportunity, and striking his hands against the window, the Grand Vizier Mesrour and the 4 slaves were with him in an instant. The slaves quickly pulled off the fisherman's clothes, and put him on the habit they had brought. They had not quite dressed the Caliph, who had seated himself on the throne that was in the hall, but were busy about him, when Sheikh Ibrahim, spurred on by interest, came back with a cane in his hand, with which he designed to pay the pretended fisherman soundly. But instead of finding him, he saw his clothes in the middle of the hall, and the Caliph on his throne, with the Grand Vizier and Mesrour on each side of him. He stood a while, gazing on this unexpected sight, doubting whether he was awake or asleep. The Caliph fell a-laughing at his astonishment, and calling to him, "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he, "what dost thou want? Whom dost thou look after?" Sheikh Ibrahim, no longer doubting that it was the Caliph, immediately threw himself at his feet, with his face and long beard to the ground. "Commander of the true believers," cried he, "your vile slave has offended you, but he implores your clemency and asks 1,000 pardons for his offence." As soon as the slaves had finished dressing him, he came down from his throne, and advancing towards him, "Rise," said he, "I forgive thee." The Caliph then addressed himself to the fair Persian, who had suspended her sorrow as soon as she understood that the garden and pavilion belonged to that prince and not to Sheikh Ibrahim, as he had all along made her believe, and that it was he himself disguised in the fisherman's clothes. "Fair Persian," said he, "rise and follow me. By what you have lately seen, you ought to know who I am, and to believe that I am above taking any advantage of the present which Nur ad-Din, with a generosity not to be paralleled, has made me of your person. I have sent him to Basra as king, and when I have given him the dispatches necessary for his establishment, you shall go thither and be queen. In the meantime, I am going to order an apartment for you in my palace, where you shall be treated according to your desert." This discourse encouraged the fair Persian, and comforted her very sensibly. The joy for the advancement of Nur ad-Din, whom she passionately loved to so high an honour, made her sufficient amends for her affliction. The Caliph kept his promise, and recommended her to the care of his Empress Zobeide, whom he acquainted with the esteem he had entertained for Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din's return to Basra was more fortunate and speedier by some days than he could have expected. Upon his arrival, without visiting any of his friends or relations, he went directly to the palace, where the king at that time was giving public audience. With the letter held up in his hand, he pressed through the crowd, who presently made way for him to come forward and deliver it. The king took and opened it, and his colour changed in reading it. He kissed it thrice, and was just about to obey the Caliph's orders, when he bethought himself of strewing it to the vizier Saouni, Nur ad-Din's irreconcilable enemy. Saoui, who had discovered Nur ad-Din and began to conjecture, with great uneasiness, what might be the design of his coming, was no less surprised than the king at the order contained in the letter, and being as much concerned in it, he instantly devised a method to evade it. He pretended not to have read the letter quite through, and therefore, desiring a second view of it, turned himself a little on one side, as if he wanted a better light, and without being perceived by anybody, dexterously tore off from the top of it the form which shewed the Caliph would be absolutely obeyed, and putting it into his mouth, swallowed it. After this egregious piece of villainy, Saoui turned to the king, and giving him the letter, "Sir," said he to him in a low voice, "what does your majesty intend to do?" "What the Caliph has commanded me," replied the king. "Have a care, sir," said the wicked vizier, "what you do. It is true this is the Caliph's hand, but the form is not to it." The king had observed it, but in his confusion thought his eyes had deceived him when he saw it was gone. "Sir," continued the vizier, "we have no reason to doubt but that the Caliph, on the complaints he has made against your majesty and myself, has granted him this letter to get rid of him, and not with any intention of having the order contained in it executed. Besides, we must consider he has sent no express with a patent, and without that the order is of no force, and since a king like your majesty was never deposed without that formality, any other man as well as Nur ad-Din might come with a forged letter. Let who will bring such a letter as this, it ought not to be put in execution. Your majesty may depend upon it, that is never done, and I will take upon myself all the consequence of disobeying this order." King Zinebi, easily persuaded by this pernicious counsel, left Nur ad-Din entirely to the discretion of the vizier Sawi, who led him to his house in a very insulting manner, and after causing him to be bastinaded till he was almost dead, he ordered him to a prison, where he commanded him to be put into the darkest and deepest dungeon, with a strict charge to the jailer to give him nothing but bread and water. When Nur ad-Din, half dead with the strokes, came to himself, and found what a dismal dungeon he was in, he bewailed his misfortunes in the most pathetic manner. "Ah, fisherman," cried he, "how hast thou cheated me, and how easy have I been in believing thee! Could I, after the civility I shewed thee, expect such inhuman and barbarous usage? However, may heaven reward thee, for I cannot persuade myself that thy intention was so base, and I will with patience wait the end of my afflictions." The disconsolate Nur ad-Din remained 6 whole days in this miserable condition, and Sawi did not forget that he had confined him there, but being resolved to put him to a shameful death, and not daring to do it by his own authority, to accomplish his villainous design, loaded some of his slaves with rich presents, which he, at the head of them, went and presented to the king. "Behold, sire," said he with the blackest malice, "what the new king has sent you upon his ascension to the crown, and begs your majesty to accept." The king, taking the matter just as Sawi intended, "What?" replied he, "is that wretch still living? I thought you had put him to death already." "Sir, I have no power," answered the vizier, "to take any person's life. That only belongs to your majesty." "Go," said the king, "behead him instantly. I give you full authority." "Sire," replied the vizier Sawi, "I am infinitely obliged to your majesty for the justice you do me, but since Nur ad-Din has publicly affronted me, I humbly beg the favour that his execution may be performed before the palace, and that the criers may publish it in every quarter of the city, so that everybody may be satisfied he has made a sufficient reparation for the affront." The king granted his request, and the criers, in performing their office, diffused universal sorrow through the whole city. The memory of his father's virtues being yet fresh among them, no one could hear without horror and indignation that the son was going to suffer an ignominious death. Sawi went in person to the prison, accompanied by 20 slaves, ministers of his cruelty, who took Nur ad-Din out of the dungeon, and put him upon a shabby horse without a saddle. When Nur ad-Din saw himself in the hands of his enemy, "Thou triumphest now," said he, "and abusest thy power, but I trust in the truth of what is written in our scripture. You judge unjustly, and in a little time you shall be judged yourself." The vizier Sawi triumphed in his heart. "What! Insolent!" said he, "darest thou insult me yet? But I care not what may happen to me, so I have the pleasure of seeing thee lose thy head in the public view of all Bassorah. Thou oughtest also to remember what another of our books says. What signifies if one dies the next day after the death of his enemy?" The vizier, implacable in his hatred and enmity, surrounded by his slaves in arms, conducted Nur ad-Din towards the palace. The people were ready to fall upon him as he passed, and if anyone had set the example, would certainly have stoned him to death. When he had brought him to the place of suffering, which was to be in sight of the king's apartment, he left him in the executioner's hands, and went straight to the king, who was in his closet, ready to glut his eyes with the bloody spectacle he had prepared. The king's guard and the vizier's slaves, who made a circle round Nur ad-Din, had much trouble to withstand the people, who made all possible efforts to break through and carry him off by force. The executioner, coming up to him, said, "I hope you will forgive me. I am but a slave, and cannot help doing my duty. If you have no occasion for anything more, I beseech you to prepare yourself, for the king is just going to give me orders to strike the blow." The unfortunate Nur ad-Din, at that moment, looking round upon the people, "Will no charitable body," cried he, "bring me a little water to quench my thirst?" Which immediately they did, and handed it up to him upon the scaffold. The Vizier Saouy, perceiving this delay, called out to the executioner from the king's closet window, where he had planted himself, "Strike! What dost thou stay for?" At these inhuman words, the whole place echoed with loud imprecations against him, and the king, jealous of his authority, made it appear, by enjoining him to stop a while, that he was angry at his presumption. But there was another reason, for the king that very moment, casting his eye towards a street that faced him, saw a troop of horsemen advancing full speed towards the palace. "Vizier," said the king immediately, "look yonder, what is the meaning of those horsemen?" Saouy, who knew not who they might be, earnestly pressed the king to give the executioner the sign. "No," replied the king, "I will first know who those horsemen are." It was the Vizier Jafir with his train, who came in person from Baghdad by the Caliph's order. To understand the occasion of this minister's coming to Basra, we must observe that after Nur ad-Din's departure with the letter, the Caliph the next day, nor for several days after, thought not of sending him the patent which he mentioned to the fair Persian. He happened one day to be in the inner palace, which was that of the women, and passing by her apartment, heard the sound of a fine voice. He listened to it, and he had no sooner heard the words of one complaining for the absence of somebody, than he asked the officer of the eunuchs, who attended him, who the woman was that lived in that apartment. The officer told him it was the young stranger's slave, whom he had sent to Basra to be king in the room of Muhammad Zinebi. "Ah, poor Nur ad-Din!" cried the Caliph, "I had forgotten thee, but hasten," said he to the officer, "and bid Jafir come to me." The Vizier was with him in an instant. As soon as he came, "Jafir," said he, "I have hitherto neglected sending the patent which was to confirm Nur ad-Din king of Basra, but we have no time now to draw up one. Therefore immediately take post horses, and with some of your servants make what haste you can to that city. If Nur ad-Din is no longer alive, but put to death by them, order the Vizier Saouy to be impaled, but if he is living, bring him to me with the king and the Vizier." The Grand Vizier stayed no longer than just to get on horseback, and being attended by a great train of officers belonging to his household, departed for Basra, where he arrived in the manner and at the time already mentioned. As soon as he came to the palace yard, the people cleared the way for him, crying out, "A pardon for Nur ad-Din!" and with his whole train he rode into the palace, even to the very stairs where he alighted. The king of Basra, knowing him to be the Caliph's chief minister, went to meet him, and received him at the entrance of his apartment. The first question the Vizier asked was, if Nur ad-Din was living, and if he was, he desired that he might be sent for. The king made answer he was alive, and gave orders to have him brought in. Accordingly he soon made his appearance as he was, bound with cords. The Grand Vizier Jafir caused him to be unbound, and setting him at liberty, ordered the Vizier Saouy to be seized, and bound him with the same cords. The Grand Vizier remained but one night at Basra, and, according to the order he had received, carried Saouy, the king of Basra, and Nur ad-Din along with him. Upon his arrival at Baghdad, he presented them to the Caliph, and after he had given him an account of his journey, and particularly the miserable condition in which he found Nur ad-Din, and his ill usage by the advice and malice of Saouy, the Caliph desired Nur ad-Din to behead the Vizier himself. "Commander of the true believers," said the generous youth, Notwithstanding the injury this wicked man has done me, and the mischief he endeavoured to do my deceased father, I should think myself the basest of mankind if I stained my hands with his blood." The Caliph was pleased with his generosity, and ordered justice to be done by the executioner. The Caliph would fain have sent Nur ad-Din to Basra as king, but he humbly begged to be excused from accepting the offer. "Commander of the true believers," said Nur ad-Din, "the city of Basra, after the misfortunes that have happened to me there, will be so much my aversion, that I beseech your majesty to give me leave to keep the oath which I have made, of never returning thither again, and I shall think it my greatest glory to serve near your royal person, if you are pleased to allow me the honour." The Caliph consented, and placing him among the number of those courtiers who were his greatest favourites, restored the fair Persian to him again. To all these favours he added a plentiful fortune, and he and the fair Persian lived together thenceforth with all the happiness this world could afford. As for the king of Basra, the Caliph contented himself with hinting how careful he ought to be in the choice of his viziers, and sent him back to his kingdom. End of section 36.